Well, good morning, Brownsbridge Church. My name is Dave, and I'm one of the pastors here at the church. And can I just start by saying how thrilled I am to be with you all today. You know, Brownsbridge is our home church. This is where we attend. My daughters attend transit just down the hall. My wife is also on staff here at the church. So it is a thrill just to be in front of you and to be part of this community here today, especially to be talking about this idea that your story is to be continued. Because I believe no matter what you're facing, no matter what situation you're in, no matter where you are today, that's not where you're going to be tomorrow. I know right off the bat, you guys have a number of questions going around in your head, and so I just want to answer all of those for you straight away, okay? So the answer to the first question you're thinking is yes, I do have an accent. The answer to your second question is no, I'm not from South Africa. I'm also not from Ireland or New Zealand or England, I'm from Australia. And when you really think about it, Australia is the real South, right? Which is probably why I feel so at home here at Brownsbridge Church. Now, the answer to the next question you have is yes, I have seen a kangaroo. But no, I have not ridden in a kangaroo's pouch. I have thrown a shrimp on the barbie, but a dingo did not eat my baby. I have been to Hillsong Church. I know quite a few of the pastors and staff there, but I did not grow up in the outback. I have, however, been to the Outback restaurant, and just a little public service announcement, Australians don't eat bloomin' onions. And personally, I've never ordered the Outback's signature sirloin, but I'm sure it's really, really good. I actually moved here to the US about 8 years ago with my wife and our 3 girls. There they are, that's Ella, Jordan, my wife Meg, gorgeous, and our eldest daughter, Chelsea. And we moved here when I accepted a position as a pastor at a local church. And I've got to be honest and tell you that that was the last thing I ever planned to do. I never grew up dreaming that one day I would be a pastor. And the reason for that is my whole adult life, I spent working as a sports reporter. I worked for newspapers and magazines. And eventually, for the last 7 years that we lived in Australia, I was a TV sports reporter and producer for a show that was our version of ESPN SportsCenter. Now, I know some of you are looking at me going, he doesn't look like a reporter, so I brought a photo. This is actually what I used to look like when I was in my reporting days. You can see I was much more clean cut then, like my hair was really neat. So this is what America did to me. So thank you, America. I appreciate it, my wife appreciates it as well. You know, when I landed in America and started working for this church, I gotta be honest, I was so intimidated working for a church because I was surrounded by all these pastors who would tell me stories that they had been called into ministry when they were like really, really young. Whereas me, I didn't even become a Christian until I was like 17. So I was intimidated by that, and I was a little bit jealous by it as well, but I completely understood it. And I understood it because I know that some things you hear best when you're young. And this is not just an idea, this is actually scientific. And I want to prove that to you today by doing a little bit of an experiment. I need some crowd participation, okay? You're in for that? In just a moment, I'm going to ask my friend Luke to play a sound. And when you hear that sound, I want you to put your hand straight up in the air. Now, here's the deal. Some of you, it might take a little bit longer to hear it, and you're going to be tempted to put your hand up even though you don't hear it. But I just want to remind you, we are in church. And so you're all on the honor system, okay? We got a deal? We ready? Okay, Luke, go for it. Okay, I see a few hands. This is awesome. I see a couple of hands here. All right, look around. The people who are putting their hand up more than likely are in their teens or very early 20s, or they've just got very good hearing, like you. Yes, that's awesome. See, what you just heard or didn't hear, because I didn't hear it, was a sound called a mosquito teen repellent. And it was developed by a high-end department store in London. This high-end store was having some problems one year with teenagers loitering around the front of all of their stores. And so the middle-aged people who would normally come in and spend money didn't come in anymore because they were scared. And so the store knew they had to do something. So they didn't want to they didn't want to call the police because that would be just negative publicity. So they reached out to this local inventor and they said, can you solve the problem? And he learned that if you play a tone at a certain frequency, it's best heard by people who are in their teens or their early 20s. So he called it the mosquito teen repellent. And he started putting speakers up around the store in all the entrances. And as soon as he started playing the sound, teenagers left in droves. And while they were walking out, middle-aged customers were walking in, blissfully unaware that the sound was even being played. So it worked. This is a great example of this idea that some things you hear best when you're young. And you know what? It makes me think, what did you hear when you were young? I'm sure some of you grew up in families where you heard that you were a great athlete. Maybe your parents told you that you were special, that you were valuable. Maybe you heard that you were a talented artist or that you were gifted academically. I bet some of you grew up in houses where you were told that you had unlimited potential. You know, when I was young, I heard the complete opposite of that. What I heard was that I was insignificant, that I was inconvenient, that I would never really amount to much, and that I was stupid. And as a result, I grew up believing that I was worthless. Now, I didn't have much choice about what I listened to when I was young, but I did have a choice, and I learned as an adult that you have a choice about who you listen for. Now, listening to something and listening for something is completely different. You often don't have a choice about what you listen to. I mean, think about it. When you're growing up at home, you kind of have to listen to your parents, right? When you move on to school, you have to listen to your teachers. And when you eventually enter the workforce, you have to listen to your boss. I mean, even in church today, you don't really have much of a choice, especially if you're in the middle of an aisle, about listening to me. But listening for something is very, very different. Listening for something means that there's an intentionality there. You know, when I get home after work in the afternoon, I don't have much choice about what I listen to. I've got 3 nearly teenage daughters. And so when I walk in, there's usually a TV blaring in one room, there's music blaring in another room, there's YouTube videos playing at a computer where nobody's sitting at. There's usually screaming and fighting going on. I don't have much of a choice about what I listen to when I walk in the door, but you can believe it. You better believe that at 5:30 every night, I am listening for my wife's car to pull up, and I'm listening for her to walk in the door. So you don't always have a choice about who or what you listen to, but you do have a choice about who you listen for. And who you listen for will shape your story. When I was growing up, I didn't have a choice but to listen to my family tell me that I was worthless, that I was an inconvenience. You see, I grew up in a family cycle of drug addiction, alcoholism, rejection, and abandonment. My mom was abandoned by her mother at a young age, and so she grew up feeling rejected. My dad grew up in a house where there was a long history of drug and alcohol addiction. It's no surprise then that when he became an adult, he struggled with that as well. He and his 2 older brothers were often in and out of jail, and his oldest brother became known as a notoriously violent inmate. He would lift weights in the yard during the day, and he led the gang that would brutally attack and assault new inmates. Now, I didn't really know my dad for the first 3 years of my life because he was in and out of prison. And when he wasn't in jail, he would often just get up and leave our family for weeks at a time. That obviously put a lot of pressure on my mum. And it wasn't long before the authorities came and took my 2 older sisters and my older brother into foster care. By the time I was about 4 or 5, my brothers and sisters were back living with us, but my mum had left my dad and had remarried. My new stepdad came from a family where alcoholism was rampant. Both of his parents were alcoholics. His dad was very physically abusive and violent with him, had a very short temper. And so it's no surprise that some of that got passed down. I was so young when my mum remarried that my stepdad became my dad, and he's who I know as dad. But he had a very short temper. He would often beat us over the smallest of things. My mum and dad would beat us with leather straps and belts, with wooden handles. Sometimes they would whip us with the cord of a vacuum cleaner. I remember one time when I was about 8 years old, my dad punished me by taking me into my room and making me sit down with a tin can and a box of matches. And he made me light a match and hold it over the tin can. And just at the point where I was about to drop the match because the flame was getting close, he grabbed my hand and he made me hold it until it burnt my fingers. And then he made me do that again and again, match after match after match. All of this stuff happening at home meant that I grew up feeling very alone, very fearful, very insignificant. Then when I was about 6 years old, my uncle, the guy who was the violent inmate in prison, came to stay with us. My parents built a guest room out in our backyard, and they made my older brother and I live out there with him. And over the next 6 years, we endured unspeakable acts of sexual abuse that left me feeling more alone, more betrayed, more insignificant than ever before. Growing up in this sort of environment meant that I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't find it easy to make friends at school, so my older brother was my best friend. I looked up to him. And that's why for me, the worst part of those 6 years of abuse was not anything that my uncle did to me. The worst part was trying to get to sleep at night with my head under my pillow to drown out the screams of my brother while he was being raped. It all ended one night when I was about 11 or 12. My uncle came home and he was drunk, and my brother and I knew that that meant that we were in for a really bad night. And I remember lying in my top bunk for what seemed like hours, listening as my uncle hurt my brother. And then somehow, from some place I don't know, suddenly I got this surge of courage, and I jumped up off my top bunk, ran out the door across the backyard, and started pounding on the back door of our house, begging my parents to open up and save us. My dad called my brother in, and it all ended that night. The next morning, my dad kicked my uncle out, and we never saw him again. But we also never spoke of this again. I never received any counseling. The authorities were never called. We just swept it under the rug. But it obviously had an ongoing impact on me. Throughout middle school and high school, I was withdrawn. I was shy. I was very scared. I was constantly bullied by other kids because I was so shy. And until I was 16 years old, I wet the bed. See, I had grown up so scared to move at night in case it woke my uncle up that I had trained my body to shut down when I went to sleep, and I didn't even wake up when I needed to go to the bathroom. things only really started to change in junior high school. That was the first time that I ever started to hear something just a little bit different. You see, I went to this public high school and we had one Christian in the whole school. And this was a kid who walked around with Jesus and Bible verses written all over his bag. He was probably the only kid in school who was more picked on than I was. I mean, even I thought he was weird. And then one day in a class, I got partnered with him for a 5-week project. And over the course of those 5 weeks, I asked him every question I had about church, the Bible, and God. And this kid never faltered once. He answered everything. And if he didn't know the answer, he went to his dad and tried to find the answer for me. And over 5 weeks, we became friends. And for the first time in my life, I felt accepted. This kid invited me to his house, and then he invited me to his church. And I felt unconditional love and acceptance for the very first time. I remember one day he invited me to this huge Christian event, and I couldn't even tell you a single thing that was said from stage. I couldn't tell you a single song that was sung. All I remember is, at the end of the day, somebody got up on stage and asked if anybody in the audience wanted to become a follower of Jesus. And I remember thinking, I am way too shy to ever stand up in front of thousands of people. I'm not doing this. So I looked around to where my friend was sitting next to me. And he was sitting there with his head down, his eyes closed, tears streaming down his face. And I knew in that moment that he was praying for me. And the feeling of unconditional acceptance and love that led to stirred something up in me that I don't remember what happened next, but the next thing I knew, I was standing down the front of that stage with somebody patting me on the back telling me I'd just become a Christian. I didn't even know how I got there. But that moment changed the course of my life forever. And it made me realize that your story is defined by listening for God, not listening to the world. In that moment, I stopped listening to the world. I stopped listening to my past. And I changed from this scared, lost little boy into this confident, outgoing young man. The next morning I woke up and it was a Sunday morning. And I remember waking up thinking, well, I'm a Christian, I guess I go to church now. And so I walked 2 miles to the nearest church. And when I first started going to church, I thought the same thing that some of you probably thought the first time you walked in here. I remember thinking, nobody in this church could possibly relate to what I've been through. Nobody in this church could possibly understand what I've gone through. But then I started reading the Bible. And some of the stories in there are even more jacked up than mine. I mean, take Joseph, for example. This is a guy that I can really relate to. I mean, Joseph is beaten up by his brothers. Then he's thrown into a well. Then he's sold into slavery. And he eventually ends up in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. But somewhere in amongst all of that, Joseph decided to stop listening to the world and start listening for God. And God steps in when Joseph hears from him and changes the trajectory of his whole life. His whole career path changes. And it's around that time that Joseph starts to get some influence. And he eventually moves up to become the prime minister of Egypt, which in those days basically meant he was the prime minister of the world. And it's at that point that his brothers come back into his life because there's a famine in the land. And his brothers need help, so they end up in Egypt looking for help, and they end up in Joseph's office asking for help. And they're really worried because they're wondering if Joseph will remember all the things that they did to him as a boy. And that's where we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 50. That's Joseph's brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Get out of my office. You did a bunch of terrible things to me, and there's not a chance in the world that I'm going to help you." That's what I would have said. But Joseph does something incredible. Joseph says to them, don't be afraid. Now that's incredible because these brothers had a lot to be afraid of after all the things that they had done to Joseph. But he isn't finished there. Joseph then goes on to say one of the most amazing lines in the entire Bible. He says to them, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Now, this is the bit I don't want you to miss. Because despite everything that had happened in his past, Joseph got to this point where he could look past what went wrong and start looking forward to what God was making right. And that meant that he could say that you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Now, I wonder what this phrase means to you today. I don't know what has happened in your life. But what if whatever you have done, what if whatever has been done to you, what if whatever situation you've been in or are in, what if God intends to use that for good? When I read this as a 17-year-old, I realized for the first time that God had a plan for every bad thing that had happened to me. Because while people, my family, had intended to harm me, while my uncle had intended to harm me, God intended it for good. Now, that might be hard for some of you to imagine. It might be hard to imagine a time when you could see the good that God could bring out of your story. I mean, it honestly took me years to get to that point. But when I did, everything changed. God turned my whole life around. I mean, if you had told the 11-year-old version of me that one day I would be a TV sports reporter doing national live crosses in Australia, I would have shook my head and said, no, not a chance. I could never do that. I'm way too shy. If you had told the 11-year-old version of me that one day I would be standing up in front of hundreds of people sharing my story, I would have shook my head because I was way too intimidated by that. I was way too scared to do anything like that. But God changed my story. And he gave me opportunities to share my story in high schools, in churches, at camps, even in prison. And as I shared my story with people, I saw that God was providing hope for others who had been through the same sort of thing that I've been through. God changed my story. And he changed my family story too. Both of my parents are Christians now. And a few years ago, I even had the opportunity to baptize my dad. Can you imagine what that was like for us? I baptized my dad. My parents always find it hard when I share my story like this because it's hard for them. But they also know that it brings so much hope to other people who are struggling. And that's one of the reasons why I love them so much. You see, when I began to listen for God in my life, I began to see God in my story. And you know, I don't know what your story is. Maybe your story is like my friends. Maybe you grew up in a family where you are constantly told how loved and valuable you are. And I hope that that's the case because I hope that my kids grow up hearing that. But statistics say that 1 in 5 boys and 1 in 3 girls will be sexually abused growing up. And that means in a room this size, there are too many people who relate to my story. Whatever your story is today, I just want to remind you and encourage you that if you listen for God in your life, you will see God in your story. Could you imagine if you could see the good that God intends to bring out of your story? Now, I know some of you are probably sitting there thinking, nothing good could ever come out of my situation. I know some of you are thinking that you might never ever feel fully loved and accepted. Some of you might be thinking that God could never change what has happened in your story. But I have found When you see God in your story, you will start looking past what went wrong and start looking forward to what He is making right. Now, for some of you in this room, you're already on this side of the equation. You already see God in your story, and that's awesome. I believe today God probably wants to use you as the voice of hope in somebody else's life, just like my friend was to me. But for some of you in this room, this might be the most important thing you need to hear today. This might be the reason why you're here. I want you to hear, I want you to know that there are people in this church who know exactly what you've been through, who can relate, and who want to help you. We have a care network who is ready to help provide you with the care and support that you need. We have pastors that want to help you. We have pastors outside the auditorium right now in the hallways, ready to talk to you, ready to help you, ready to start walking with you. Now, I know that it can be so intimidating to walk up to somebody you don't really know and start sharing your story with them. So in an effort to make that easier, we created a website. If you're sitting here today and you're thinking, me too, Dave, I've been through the same sort of thing, or me too, I want to start seeing God in my story, then we've created this website, brownsbridge.org/me too. And you can go there, provide a few details, and we will have a pastor reach out to you as soon as possible and start giving you the care and support that you need. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to pray. And then the band's going to come out. We're going to stand and sing a final song. And if you're here today saying, me too, I need to see God in my story, that might be the perfect time for you to slip out and go and speak to one of our pastors who are waiting out in the halls. Maybe as the band sings, you want to stand up and you want to sing the song with them. Maybe you want to just stand there and listen to the lyrics of this song. But if you're sitting here today and you desperately want to see God in your story, then you owe it to yourself to speak to somebody today. We don't want anybody to leave without feeling that unconditional support and love that I felt when I knew that my friend was praying for me. You see, today I believe that you can stop listening to the lies that you've been told your whole life and start listening for the truth. Let's pray. God, I thank you that you are the God of my story. You are the God of all the stories that are in this room. And Father, today I pray that your voice would be loud, that your voice would be clear, that you would remind people that you are walking beside them and you intend to bring good out of their story. Father, may that truth be so strong and obvious today. And God, I pray that as that truth sinks in, God, that you would shine a light where there is darkness, that you would bring hope where there is hopelessness. God, that you would mend everything that has been broken. And God, I pray that you would bring healing spiritually and emotionally and physically as we start to listen for you and start to see you in our story. We pray all of this in the amazing healing name of Jesus. And everybody said, amen.
We are His love He lavished on us and called us children of the King. And in His loving kindness, He chose the lowly and the weak. And His heart is good. He is always kind. With the cross He threw, He is on our side. 'Cause we are the sons, we are the daughters of God. No matter where we go, we're close to the Father's heart. And though we stumble, He will not let us fall. We are the Lord's, and He will never forsake His own. 'Cause we are the sons, we are the daughters of God. When the lies speak louder than the truth, remind me that I belong to You. And when I can't see past the dark of night, remind me You're always by my side. When the lies speak louder than the truth, remind me that I belong to You. When I can't see past the dark of night, please remind me You're always by my side. Oh, when the lies speak louder than the truth, remind me that I belong to You. And when I can't see past the dark of night, remind me You're always by my side. You're by my side. 'Cause we are the sons, we are the daughters of God. And no matter where we go, we're close to the Father's heart. And though we stumble, He will not let us fall. We are the Lord's, and He will never forsake His own. 'Cause we are the sons, we are the daughters of God. Thank you for being with us today. We love you. Have a great week. You're dismissed.